coffee in my hand had gone cold by the time my daughter's new father-in-law finished his toast. I remember staring at the cup, white porcelain, a small chip on the rim. I focused on that chip because if I looked up, I was going to do something that couldn't be undone. Not yet. The moment wasn't right yet. He was still talking. And of course, he said, his voice carrying easily across the ballroom, we're so glad that Daniel found a woman with good values. Good family, the kind of upbringing that matters. He paused just long enough to let his eyes sweep the room, past me, through me, like I was part of the floral arrangement. Not everyone can say that. 300 people heard it. Some of them laughed, the uncertain kind of laugh people do when they're not sure if something was a joke. My daughter, sitting at the head table in her white dress, went very still. My son-in-law put his hand over hers. I set down my coffee cup carefully so it wouldn't make a sound. I had waited 31 years for this moment. I could wait another 20 minutes. My name is Carol, and I have been a nurse for 38 years. I worked the overnight shift at St. Catherine's Medical Center in Providence, Rhode Island for most of those years, 11 at night to 7 in the morning, the hours when people are most afraid and least pretending to be otherwise. I learned things in that job that you can't unlearn. How to stay calm when everything is falling apart. How to read a room. How to wait. My husband Ray died in 1994. He was 34 years old. We had been married 6 years. Our daughter Melissa was 4. I was 32, and I thought my life was over. Ray worked in commercial construction management. He was the kind of man who wore his hard hat to dinner sometimes, just forgot to take it off, and you couldn't be annoyed because he'd also bring you wildflowers he spotted growing through a crack in the parking lot. He was careful, methodical. He kept notebooks, actual spiral-bound notebooks, with every safety observation, every concern, every violation he spotted on a job site. He believed in doing things right. He had the particular stubbornness of a man who grew up poor and decided that integrity was the one thing nobody could take from him. In the spring of 1994, Ray was the site safety coordinator on a construction project in downtown Providence. A large mixed-use development, retail on the ground floor, condominiums above. The developer was a company called Hargrove Meridian Construction. The project was behind schedule, which meant it was over budget, which meant pressure was coming down from somewhere. Ray's notebooks from those last 3 months are full of concerns, load-bearing calculations that didn't match the amended plans, material substitutions that weren't documented properly. A structural engineer's report that appeared was referenced in a meeting and then vanished from the official file. On May 17, 1994, a section of the third-floor framework collapsed during a concrete pour. 4 workers were injured. Ray was killed. He was 40 feet below the collapse point, inspecting a foundation issue he'd flagged the previous week. The official report said he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Accident. Tragic, but unavoidable. The kind of thing that happens in construction, the OSHA investigator told me when I sat across from him in a plastic chair 3 weeks after I buried my husband, with my 4-year-old daughter drawing horses on a notepad in my lap. I nodded. I thanked him for his time. I didn't believe a single word. The first year after Ray died, I kept working because I had no choice. I picked up extra shifts. My mother drove up from Warwick to watch Melissa 3 nights a week, and I paid her back in groceries and the kind of guilt that settles into the spaces between words. I told Melissa her daddy had gone to heaven because of an accident at work. She asked me if it hurt. I said no, because she was 4, and some questions you answer with what a child needs rather than what is true. What I didn't tell anyone, not my mother, not my sister, not the other nurses I worked with, was what I was doing in the hours between my shift ending and Melissa waking up. I was reading, building codes, structural engineering standards, OSHA regulations, workers' compensation law, wrongful death statutes. I am a nurse, not a lawyer or an engineer, but I am very good at learning things I need to know, and I needed to know if Ray's death was what they said it was. 6 months in, I found the first thread. A former subcontractor on the Providence project, a man named Gus, who did ironwork and had been quietly let go 2 weeks before the collapse, had filed a complaint with the State Labor Board. Not about the accident, about unpaid wages, but in the complaint, almost as an aside, he mentioned that he'd been told to ignore a specific load tolerance discrepancy by the project's executive director. The executive director of Hargrove Meridian Construction was a man named Stuart Whitmore. I wrote that name in a notebook. Ray's kind of notebook. I want to be clear about something because I've thought about this for a long time. I didn't spend 30 years consumed by hatred. That's not what it was. I raised my daughter. I worked my shifts. I coached Melissa's soccer team for 4 years, even though I knew nothing about soccer and had to watch YouTube videos to understand what offsides meant. I taught her to drive in the parking lot of a shuttered Kmart on a Saturday morning, and I sat in the passenger seat and did not scream once, which remains one of my finest achievements. I had a full life. I loved my daughter fiercely. I laughed. Some years I laughed a lot. But in the quiet hours, the very late ones, I kept the notebook. I followed the threads. A civil lawsuit filed by 2 of the injured workers settled confidentially in 1997. A second OSHA complaint filed anonymously in 2001, referencing the same project, closed without action. A local news article from 2003 mentioning that Hargrove Meridian had won a major contract with the state of Rhode Island for a new government building, with a quote from the company's CEO praising the vision of its founder. Stuart Whitmore. He had not gone to prison. He had not paid a fine. He had gotten bigger. I kept writing things down. Melissa was 22 when she called me to say she'd met someone. A graduate student at Brown, an economics PhD candidate named Daniel. She was flushed with it the way you are when something is new and feels like it might be everything. And I listened to her talk for 45 minutes without interrupting, which is another of my finest achievements. She brought him home for Thanksgiving that year. He was quiet in the careful way that means someone is paying attention. He helped with the dishes without being asked. He asked about Ray. Melissa had told him, of course, and he didn't say I'm sorry for your loss the way most people do, like it's something to be gotten through. He said he sounds like someone who would have been worth knowing. I had to look out the window for a moment. I liked him very much. They dated for 3 years. He finished his PhD, got a teaching position at a small college in Connecticut. They moved to New Haven together. I visited on holidays. Melissa called 3 times a week, which was more than I deserved and exactly what I needed. When Daniel asked my permission to propose, old-fashioned, which I found charming, he drove up to Providence specifically to ask me in person. We sat at my kitchen table and he was visibly nervous, which endeared him to me enormously. I said yes, of course. I asked if he took his coffee with milk. He said black, and I decided he was essentially my son. It was only afterward, when he mentioned his father's name, that my kitchen went sideways. Daniel's last name is Whitmore. I sat very still for a very long time after he left that afternoon, long enough that the shadows in the kitchen moved. Then I did what I always do. I got out a notebook. I needed to know if it was the same family. I told myself it might not be. Whitmore is not a rare name. Daniel was from Connecticut, not Rhode Island. It might be coincidence. It took me 4 days of careful searching to confirm it was not a coincidence. Stuart Whitmore, the man who built Hargrove Meridian, who had been executive director during Ray's death, who had settled lawsuits quietly and emerged from every investigation unscathed, lived in Greenwich, Connecticut. He had a son named Daniel, who was 30 years old, who had just gotten a teaching position in New Haven. I sat with that for a long time. I want to tell you that I was calm and clear-headed and immediately knew what to do. But the truth is, I sat at my kitchen table and cried in a way I hadn't cried since the week Ray died. Not because I was angry, though I was. because it felt like the universe had made a very specific, very cruel joke, and I didn't know yet whether it was the kind of joke that ends in disaster or the kind that ends in something you couldn't have planned. I didn't tell Melissa. I know how that sounds. I've turned it over in my mind 1,000 times. But here is what I knew. Melissa loved Daniel. Daniel was not his father, and I had spent 30 years building a case that was almost complete. The last piece I needed was a witness, someone who had been on the inside of Hargrove Meridian and would talk. If I told Melissa, she would either leave Daniel, which would break her heart over something that wasn't his fault, or she would stay and confront her future father-in-law, which would alert him, and everything I had spent 30 years building would collapse before I could use it. So I kept it. I kept it through the engagement party, where I met Stuart Whitmore for the first time and shook his hand and smiled while my pulse was doing something a cardiologist would find concerning. He didn't know who I was. Why would he? I was a nurse from Providence. Ray had been a mid-level safety coordinator. Stuart Whitmore had made decisions that killed men and moved on to larger projects. I smiled. I said it was lovely to meet him. I excused myself to find more coffee. Here is what Melissa did not tell me until 6 months before the wedding. She had known. Not everything, not the notebooks, not the years of research, but about 2 years into dating Daniel, he had mentioned carefully that his father's company had been involved in a construction accident in Providence in the 90s. He'd heard it referenced once, obliquely, when he was in college. He'd looked it up. He'd seen Ray's name in the accident report. He hadn't told her for weeks. When he did, she spent 3 days deciding whether to tell me. She decided not to, because she loved him and believed he was nothing like his father, because she was afraid of what I would do, because, she told me later, sobbing in my arms 6 months before her wedding, she thought she was protecting me. We had both been sitting on the same secret, alone, for 2 years, trying to protect each other. That's the thing about grief that people don't tell you. It makes you very good at carrying things quietly. Too good sometimes. I held her while she cried, and I told her it was all right. And I meant it, because it was. She had not done anything wrong. She had done exactly what I had done, tried to spare someone she loved. I told her there was something I needed to finish first, and then it would be all right. I asked her to trust me. She looked at me for a long moment, my daughter with her father's stubborn mouth. Then she said, "Okay." The wedding was held on a Saturday in October at a country inn in Litchfield County, Connecticut. It was the kind of fall day that makes New England look like it's trying to show off. The maple outside the ceremony tent was the color of something on fire, and the air smelled like wood smoke and cold coming. Melissa was extraordinary. I know every mother says this. I am saying it as a nurse who has seen extraordinary things. My daughter walking down that aisle was one of the most beautiful things I have ever witnessed. She was steady and radiant, and when she looked at Daniel, there was nothing performed about it. I sat in the second row. I had specifically been placed in the second row, I learned later, at Stuart Whitmore's suggestion to the wedding coordinator. The mother of the groom's family in front, the single mother of the bride, the nurse from Providence, 1 row back. I noticed. I filed it away. The ceremony was perfect. The reception was held in the inn's main ballroom, 280 people, and dinner was a New England menu, lobster bisque, beef tenderloin, the kind of meal that costs more than my first car. I ate carefully. I drank 1 glass of wine and switched to water. I had a meeting that evening with a man named Philip Chen, a journalist from the Providence Journal who had spent the last 8 months working with me on the documentation I'd assembled over 30 years. We had talked every 2 weeks for those 8 months. He had verified everything independently. His editor had approved the story. It was scheduled to publish the following Monday, but Philip and I had agreed on something else, a small insurance policy. Philip was at the reception. He was there as Daniel's former college classmate, which was true. They'd overlapped for 1 year at Brown, and Daniel had genuinely been the one to connect us unknowingly at a dinner party 2 years earlier. He was seated at a table near the back. He had a recorder and a notebook, and I had in my evening bag a sealed envelope. Inside the envelope was a letter. It contained a summary of everything: the falsified structural reports, the material substitutions, the suppressed engineering findings, the confidential settlements, the OSHA complaints that disappeared, all of it sourced, verified, documented. At the bottom, the letter named Ray. It named the 4 men who were injured. It named Stuart Whitmore. I had written it very carefully. Stuart Whitmore stood to give his toast 40 minutes into dinner. He was 71 years old, silver-haired, the kind of man who fills a room with the confidence of someone who has never once been held accountable for anything. He loved his son. I believe that genuinely. He spoke about Daniel with a warmth that was real, and then he talked about the importance of good family, good values, good upbringing. He let his eyes move across the room and past me. "Not everyone can say that," he said. "Some people laughed." I looked at the chip in the rim of my coffee cup. I thought about Ray's notebooks, lined up in a box in my closet for 30 years. I thought about Melissa at 4 years old, asking me if it hurt. I thought about everything I had carried quietly for so long because the moment wasn't right. Then I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I have worked overnight emergency shifts for 38 years. I know how to make a room hear you without shouting. I'd like to say a few words, if I may. The room shifted. Stuart Whitmore looked at me with the polite blankness of a man who still did not know who I was. "My name is Carol. I'm Melissa's mother." I smiled at my daughter. She had gone very still, but her eyes were steady. She knew I would not do anything wrong. I worked the overnight shift at a hospital for most of my adult life, so I'll keep this brief because I'm better at 4 in the morning than I am at dinner parties. A small laugh, genuine, from the tables around me. I raised my daughter alone. Her father, Ray, died when she was 4. He was a safety coordinator on a construction site in Providence, Rhode Island, in the spring of 1994. I paused. The site was owned and developed by Hargrove Meridian Construction. The room was very quiet, not the polite quiet of a toast, the grim kind. A section of the framework collapsed. 4 men were seriously injured. Ray was killed. I looked now directly at Stuart Whitmore. He had gone the particular color of a man who has just understood something irreversible. The cause was a series of decisions made by site management, decisions that were subsequently concealed from state investigators, falsified documentation, a suppressed structural engineer's report, material substitutions that were never filed. Someone at a nearby table said something quietly. Someone else told them to shush. I have spent 30 years documenting what happened. Those documents are now in the possession of the Providence Journal. They publish Monday. I reached into my evening bag and set the sealed envelope on the table in front of me. "This is a courtesy copy, Mr. Whitmore, for your attorneys." I looked at my daughter. She had tears running down her face, but she was nodding. I looked at Daniel. He was very pale, but his jaw was set in the stubborn way that I had come to recognize as the thing his mother had given him, the thing that was not his father. "Melissa," I said, "your father would have been so proud of you, not because of tonight, because of every day." My voice did something I had to control. "He was a good man who believed in doing things right. You are his daughter." I picked up my water glass. "To the bride and groom." The room was still for one long moment. Then my new son-in-law stood up. He raised his glass. His voice was thick. "To Carol," he said, "and to Ray." The room followed. Stuart Whitmore did not raise his glass. He sat very still and looked at the envelope on the table, and I watched something leave his face. The certainty, the ease, the particular confidence of a man who has never faced what he's done. He faced it now. Philip's story ran on Monday. It was thorough. It was devastating. By Wednesday, the State Attorney General's office had announced a review. By the end of the month, 3 of the surviving witnesses, men who had stayed quiet for 30 years because they'd signed confidentiality agreements as part of the civil settlements, had spoken to investigators, freed by the public attention in a way they hadn't been able to free themselves. Stuart Whitmore retained a criminal defense attorney. I don't know what will happen with the case. The law is complicated and he has resources and these things take time, but I have learned patience. Daniel did not attend the honeymoon. He spent a week with his mother, separately from his father, and I do not know what was said. He called me from New Haven about 10 days after the wedding. He said, "I need you to know that I had no part in any of it. And I need to know if you believe me." I said I believed him, because I did. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think I always knew something was wrong. I just didn't let myself look." "That's very human," I said. "Is it fixable?" "Most things are," I said. "That's the thing nobody tells you." He said, "Thank you for not hating me." I told him that he was my son and to go take care of my daughter. Melissa came to Providence for Christmas that year. She drove up with Daniel and their 2 bags and a Christmas tree they'd bought from a lot in New Haven that was slightly too tall for my living room and had to be trimmed at the top. And we spent an evening laughing about it while Daniel did battle with the stand and Melissa made her grandmother's mulled cider recipe on the stove. On Christmas morning, she gave me a gift wrapped in silver paper. Inside was a notebook, a spiral-bound one, the same kind Ray used, the same kind I used, and on the first page, in her handwriting, she had written, "For the next chapter." Whatever it is, I held it for a long time. I had carried that story for 30 years, alone mostly, in the quiet hours, the late ones when the rest of the world was asleep and I was still going. I put it down, finally. The coffee on the counter was hot. The tree was slightly crooked. My son-in-law was losing an argument with a string of lights. My daughter was singing something under her breath in the kitchen. I opened the notebook to the first page. I didn't write anything yet. I just held it. That felt like enough. I've thought a lot about what the word patience actually means. People use it like it's passive, like waiting is the same as doing nothing. But the 31 years I spent building that case weren't passive. Every notebook I filled, every public record I requested, every thread I followed at 2 in the morning after a 12-hour shift. That was patience as a form of work. The quietest kind of work there is. Stuart Whitmore made decisions that killed my husband and then walked away. He walked away because he had money and lawyers, and the particular confidence of a man who assumes consequences are for other people. And for a long time, he was right. That's the hard part to sit with. He wasn't wrong for 30 years. The system moved around him, the settlements got signed, the complaints got closed. What he miscalculated was that I was still there, still writing things down. I think about Melissa keeping her secret and me keeping mine, and both of us alone with the weight of it for 2 years. That used to make me sad in a way I couldn't fully name. Now I think I understand it better. We were both trying to protect something. She was protecting her mother from pain, and I was protecting my daughter from a choice she shouldn't have had to make. Neither of us was wrong exactly. We were just carrying things the way women in this family tend to carry things. Quietly, completely, until we don't have to anymore. The difference between me and Stuart Whitmore was never power. He had far more of that than I did for most of my life. The difference was what we each chose to do with what we knew. He chose to bury it. I chose to document it. One of those choices compounds over time in your favor, and one of them doesn't. Ray believed that integrity was the one thing nobody could take from you. I used to think that was almost naive. Something a good man tells himself to feel better about not being rich or powerful. I don't think that anymore. Integrity isn't about how you feel. It's about what you build, slowly, over time, when nobody's watching. Ray built it in his notebooks. I built it in mine. And when the moment finally came, we had something real to stand on. Daniel asked me once if I thought his father was beyond repair. I told him I didn't know, and that wasn't really my question to answer. My question, the one I'd been answering for 3 decades, was whether Ray's death would mean something, whether the truth would outlast the cover-up. That's the only thing I ever had control over. Melissa gave me a blank notebook on Christmas morning, and I held it and didn't write anything yet. That wasn't emptiness. That was the specific feeling of having finished something enormous and being, for the first time in a very long time, free to choose what comes next. I'm still deciding. That's all right. I've earned the right to take my time.